Hello again, kids. It's good to see you all again for Sunday school. Thanks for joining us. And this will be our lesson now on question 14 of the New City Catechism. So I've written the question up here on the board, and we'll go over that first, and then we're going to talk about what the Bible teaches about what this question asks and then answers. So for question 14, the question is, did God create us unable to keep His law? And the answer is no, but because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, we are all born in sin and guilt, unable to keep God's law. Let's go over that again. Did God create us unable to keep His law? No, but because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, we are all born in sin and guilt, unable to keep God's law. I'm going to read the question one more time, and I want you, make sure you at home read the answer with me if you can. And if you can't read yet, just say it as best you can remember. So the question, did God create us unable to keep His law? Say it with me if you can. No, but because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, we are all born in sin and guilt, unable to keep God's law. Now, parents, if you want to practice that several times, of course, you have the ability to rewind and play that over and over as your children say it over and over. But let's talk about what this answer means here. The question is asking us, how did God make us in the beginning when He originally created human beings? Did He make us in a way that we were unable to obey Him? Now, we talked about last time how none of us can keep God's law. But we said specifically that that is since the fall. And so now we're asking the question, what about before the fall? When God made us, were we unable to keep His law? And the answer is no, we were able to keep His law. He made us in a way that Adam and Eve could have obeyed His law. But because they didn't obey, and you know that story, right? What happened? What did Adam and Eve do to disobey God? Go ahead and answer out loud. What did Adam and Eve do? Did you say that they ate the fruit that God told them not to eat? That's right. So even though they were created able to keep God's law, because of their disobedience, because of what they did in the Garden of Eden so long ago, all of us who are their descendants, we are all born in sin and guilt, unable to keep God's law. So think of it this way. Adam and Eve were in a special place. They were in God's presence in the garden where they had life from God. But because of their sin, He exiled them. He kicked them out of the garden, out of His presence, where now they came under the rule of death. And so outside the garden, where all human beings have been born ever since, we are not able to keep God's law. So there's been different understandings by different people about what does it mean to be born into this world as a descendant of Adam? What does it mean that we are born after the fall? What's the result upon our human nature? So I've got some cups here. I want to use an illustration. Let's imagine that this cup represents Adam, the way God designed him. You see, this is a perfectly good styrofoam cup, and it could hold any kind of liquid you wanted to pour in it. And that means that it's a cup that can fulfill its purpose. So God created Adam in a way that Adam could have obeyed God. And the cup, just like the cup could hold water, Adam could have obeyed God. But what happened to all of us as a result of Adam's sin in the garden? Well, some people have argued that we're still a good cup. We're still a whole cup. We can still hold water. Each one of us is created just the same way Adam was, able to obey God's law, just like Adam would have been able to obey. Some have said that, so you could think of one view being the view that we're like whole cups and that Adam's sin has not made any difference in terms of affecting us that way. I've got another cup here. I want you to notice what I've done with it. I've torn a piece out of it. So I want to ask you, could this cup hold water if I tried to pour water into it? what would happen? Well, it might hold a little bit of water at the bottom, but eventually, if I poured enough, it's going to start spilling out the side. So some people have argued that sin is like that. Adam's sin has left us a little bit broken. And here's the piece that was broken out. So I could repair this piece. You know, I could put this piece back in its place. And, of course, I'd probably need some tape to make it really secure. But I could put the piece back in and make this cup whole again. And with some tape, I could make this a cup that holds water again. So one view would say Adam's sin has not affected us. We're still like whole cups. Another view would say we're like broken cups, but we can be fixed. We can be fixed with a little bit of work. That's the second view that some have argued regarding the effect of sin on us. Here's a third view, and this is a view that was held by a theologian whom I'm a big fan of, named Augustine. Augustine said it's more like this. Adam was created as a whole cup, and then once he sinned, this is what happened to us. We were completely broken. Now let me ask you something. Is this cup ever going to hold water? Is this cup ever going to be in a position where it could do what it was created to do? According to Augustine, and he was reading the Bible when he made this argument, he was trying to understand what the Bible teaches. He said, this is like what has happened to us because of Adam's sin. We're completely broken. Sin has affected us to such a degree because of Adam's fall that none of us are able to keep God's law at all. And so we are left completely broken, and what is needed then is that we need to be made completely new by God's power. So which one of these views do you think best represents the truth or what the Bible teaches? Is it that we are still whole cups? Is it that we are slightly broken but we can be fixed? Or is it that we are ruined and we need to be made new? Well, let's look at the Bible to see what the Bible tells us about ourselves. If you have a Bible, we're going to be looking at Ephesians chapter 2. So parents, kids, if you know how to get to Ephesians, go ahead and get to Ephesians chapter 2. And we're going to look first at verses 1, 2, and 3 of Ephesians 2. And these three verses Paul wrote are going to tell us what the result of the fall is upon us. What has Adam's sin done to us? This is what Paul says to those in Ephesus. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. Now, which one of these cups do you think, which one of these cups do you think best fits that description of being dead in trespasses and sin? Is it the whole cup? Is it the cup with one broken piece? Or is it the cup that's completely destroyed? Which one of these is dead, you would say? I think it's the third one. I think it's the cup that's completely destroyed, and that's a good picture of what has happened to us because of sin. We are dead in trespasses and sins, and thus completely unable to obey God on our own. In these three verses, I want you to notice specifically what Paul says about the powers that have influence over us. He mentions the world in verse 2. I want to write these on the board here. He mentions the world in verse 2 because he says, you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world. Now, the Bible often uses the term world to refer to all the evil that's out there against God. All the things that are out there that influence us to make us want to disobey God. That's the world. And we live in this world that is rebelling against God, and that influences us to want to sin. But that's not the only thing that influences us. Look at verse 3. among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. So the world influences us to sin, but guess what? So does the flesh. That means our own selves. We influence ourselves. We have our own inward desires to sin. And I know, kids, that you have probably disobeyed your parents from time to time, and you have sometimes this desire in you. When your parents tell you to do something, you have this desire that creeps up that says, I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. And you have this instinctive desire to rebel against authority. Maybe you don't act on it, but I know that that's there within you. And I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in so many others. But that's what we call the flesh. So the world is like the world out there that tells us to sin. The flesh, though, is like our own hearts telling us to sin. And then behind all of it is a character we know from the Bible. In verse 2 again, it says, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of the disobedience. Now that's an odd phrase, but who is the prince of the power of the air, the spirit now at work in the sons of disobedience? Who's the powerful spiritual force who is against God and who has power over this world? If you said the devil, you're right. We call him the devil or Satan. There's a powerful spiritual force that is against God as well. So we live in the world that is rebelling against God. We have desires of our hearts that want to disobey God, and we are under the power of the devil who is rebelling against God. We are under the world, the flesh, and the devil. This is the condition we're born into because of the fall, because of Adam's sin. And what's the result of all of this? Again, look at verse 3. Among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. All of these things are leading us to one destination: wrath. Who knows what wrath is? Wrath is God's anger and judgment against our sin. You see, God is holy. We sang that song last week, Holy, 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 to speak of how holy God is. And because He's holy, He is completely opposed to our sin and to all these things that have power over us. And if we remain under the power of these things, we will face God's wrath on the day He judges the world. And that means we will be sent away from Him into exile forever. And we call that hell. And that is a terrifying thing to contemplate. But it's important for us to understand that we really can only take in the good news about Jesus once we've understood first the bad news about ourselves. And the bad news is that just like that cup that was ruined, we have been ruined by sin. We have been put under the power of the world, the flesh, and the devil, and we are destined for God's wrath. So which cup do you think fits the description best according to the Bible? I think it's that third cup, the one that was destroyed, and the need then is that we be made completely new. So that's the bad news, verses 1 through 3. But now I want to share with you the best news in the world. The best news in the world starts in verse 4. And this is what Paul says, starting in verse 4 of our passage. But God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with Him, and seated us with Him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages He might show the immeasurable riches of His grace in kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. So these three verses tell us what God has done in response to our sin. These are the things we did. These are things that have power over us. This is our destiny. But God has done something greater for those who are in Christ. And Paul says He has made us alive. That means He's raised us to spiritual life with Christ. He made us alive. He He raised us up with him. So Jesus was raised from the dead, and then he went up into heaven to the right hand of the Father. So just like him, we have been raised from the dead spiritually, and we have been taken up to heaven spiritually. And then it says that he was seated with him. We are seated with him. So Christ was seated at the right hand of the Father. So we are seated with him in heaven if we believe in him. So if you are in Christ, if you're a believer in him, that means that God has done those three things for you, spiritually speaking. You're raised with him, you're taken up to heaven with him, and you're now seated with him. And that is what defines who you are. These things don't define it anymore if you are in Christ. So that's the best news imaginable, what God has done for us, even though we were sinners against him. And then how does this all happen? Well, Paul tells us in verses 8 to 10. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. When Paul says in verse 8, by grace you have been saved, what he means is grace means God's favor that you don't deserve. You did nothing to deserve God making you new, God giving you life. But if you are saved, if you are a believer in Christ, then it has come completely by God's grace, his favor that you don't deserve. And then Paul says it's through faith, not according to works, not based on works. So we are only saved from God's coming wrath if we trust God's promise that's given to us in Christ, if we rest in Christ alone and not on our own works. Just like that third cup, if that third cup is really us, if we really have been destroyed by sin, is that cup going to hold any water? No, and that's like us trying to do good works. It's like us trying to pour water into a broken cup. It's not going to hold water. It has to be made new first. And so that's what's happened through Christ. We are made new so that we can then perform good works out of gratitude toward God because he prepared us to do that. But our good works are not what save us before God. Our good works do not please God for salvation. Rather, Christ has done that. We must believe in Christ. And then God makes us new so that we can walk in the good works, the good things he wants us to do and he has planned for us. So what this is all telling us is that yes, we are broken, we are fallen because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the garden. But once we understand how far we have fallen and how broken we are, we can also then understand how wonderful and amazing God's grace is in Jesus Christ. So let's go over our question one or two more times here just to practice. So here's the question. Did God create us unable to keep his law? The answer, no. But because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, we are all born in sin and guilt, unable to keep God's law. I encourage you to practice that a few times until you can say it from memory. So we're going to end today with another song. We're going to sing the song Amazing Grace to celebrate the grace of God that is given to those who believe in Christ. And if you know the words, I want you to sing along with me. We'll sing it a couple of times, the first verse, so that you can sing along with us. But think about what these words mean. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. So that means God's grace, God's favor that we don't deserve is amazing. It's not something that's expected. It's something that amazes us, that causes us to wonder at how gracious God is. And then the next part says, I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. God is the one who finds us. God is the one who gives us sight. God, in his grace, does all these wonderful things for us. So please sing along with me as I sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. One more time. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Thank you for being here. See you next time.